The harsh Arizona Territory sun beat down on Margaret's isolated cabin, where she had lived alone for 7 years. No visitors, no conversation, just the whisper of wind through pine trees and occasional distant thunder. Her hands, once soft and pampered in Boston society, now calloused from survival, trembled as she aimed her father's old rifle at the Apache man standing silently at the edge of her property. He made no threatening moves, just watched her with eyes that seemed to understand isolation better than words ever could. Days passed. He returned, leaving small offerings, rabbit meat, repaired fence posts, wildflowers. Never speaking, never demanding. Could a woman who had sworn off men forever find healing in the arms of a man society had cast aside? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last echoes of Boston society still haunted Margaret Whitmore's hands each morning. 7 years had passed, yet her fingers still moved with practiced grace as she drew the tarnished silver hairbrush through her once auburn hair, now streaked with silver despite her 32 years. The ritual remained, though the woman performing it had transformed entirely. Boston, 1867, Margaret Elizabeth Harrington had been the jewel of her season, educated at the finest finishing schools and groomed for a marriage that would elevate the family name. Charles Whitmore had seen the answer to every parent's prayer. Handsome, charming, heir to the Whitmore banking fortune. His courtship had been a whirlwind of opera boxes, private dinners, and carefully chaperoned walks through Boston Common, where his hand would occasionally brush hers, sending thrills of anticipation through her naive heart. "You are a vision, my dear," he had whispered at their engagement party, "a treasure I shall keep all to myself." Those words, once thrilling, now chilled her blood in retrospect. For keeping her all to himself had been precisely his intention. The isolation began so gradually she scarcely noticed. Charles's reasonable objections to certain friendships, his concern about her family's overly familiar manner, his insistence that a Whitmore wife maintain certain standards of association. By their first anniversary, her social circle had dwindled to his approved acquaintances, wealthy, respectable, and utterly under his influence. Margaret set down the hairbrush and glanced at her reflection in the small cracked mirror above her washbasin. The soft curves of privilege had given way to the lean angles of survival. Boston Margaret would have been horrified at the sun-browned skin and calloused hands. Arizona Territory Margaret saw only the strength she'd never known she possessed. The memories still surfaced without warning. Charles returning home late, reeking of another woman's perfume. The ledger she discovered with thousands missing diverted to accounts she could not trace. The whispers at social gatherings that ceased when she approached. The final humiliation, finding him with Eliza Montgomery, her own second cousin, in their marital bed. The confrontation had erupted in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore summer estate, champagne flutes shattering as she named his transgressions before Boston's elite. The scandal might have been weathered, the wealthy closed ranks around their own, had she not also revealed his financial immaturities. Money was sacrosanct in ways, fidelity was not. His brother Richard had come to her the following day, his offer brutally clear: a quiet divorce with minimal settlement, or financial ruin for her family through called-in loans and blacklisted businesses. Her father's heart condition left little choice. "Take this and disappear," Richard had said, sliding an envelope across the table. "The Western Territories are vast and forgiving, even for women who forget their place there." Margaret stepped outside her cabin into the crisp morning air, the distant silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains purple against the dawn sky. The money had been enough to purchase this remote homestead from a widower heading east, with sufficient remainder to establish modest provisions. The cabin, a crude structure compared to Beacon Hill mansions, had seemed barely habitable that first terrible winter. She still remembered the first time she'd aimed a rifle, hands shaking so badly she'd missed the deer entirely, how she'd sobbed from hunger and frustration, how she'd nearly given up countless times that first year. Yet somehow, sunrise after sunrise, she had persisted, learning to hunt, to preserve food, to repair roof leaks and broken hinges, to exist entirely without servants or assistants, and to maintain her vow, never again to trust a man's words or depend upon a man's presence. Margaret's gaze drifted to the small stack of firewood by her door, wood she hadn't chopped, to the repaired chicken coop she hadn't fixed, to the patch of wildflowers that hadn't grown there last season. She hadn't spoken aloud in so long. Her voice might have atrophied entirely if not for occasional songs hummed while working. Speaking to another human seemed a foreign concept now, especially to a man, especially to him. The quiet Apache whose dark eyes held neither demand nor expectation, just patience, and perhaps something she dared not name. Nako, who moved like morning mist through the juniper trees, his moccasined feet finding purchase on the rocky slope without disturbing so much as a pebble. The hunting trail was ancient, used by his people long before white settlers claimed the land with paper documents and wooden stakes. The Apache way recognized no ownership of earth. One might as well claim ownership of sky or wind, yet he respected boundaries of a different sort. The woman's cabin sat in the small valley below, smoke curling from its stone chimney against the dawn light. For 3 changing of seasons, he had observed her from distances such as this. Not as prey, though his tracking skills had been honed hunting deer and elk. Rather, with the curious recognition of a kindred spirit. He touched the medicine pouch at his waist, feeling the familiar contours of the contents within. Small stones from sacred places, dried sage and cedar for cleansing. A hawk feather from his naming ceremony, the elements that connected him to the spirits of his ancestors, even as he walked a path apart from his tribe. The man between worlds carries medicine of both, his grandfather had told him before the separation. This is burden and gift alike. Nako had been born to an Apache mother and a Mexican trader father, his mixed blood marking him as different from birth. Among his mother's people, he learned the old ways, tracking, hunting, the language of earth and sky. From his father came Spanish words, numbers for trading, and strange stories of distant cities. When tensions erupted between settlers and tribe, such divided heritage became dangerous. Choose your side, the war chief had demanded. Nako had chosen peace. The choice cost him his place among the people. Now he watched, as the solitary woman emerged from her cabin, rifle balanced in the crook of her arm, as she made her morning inspection of the perimeter. Her vigilance reminded him of a doe with fawn, alert to every shadow and sound. He had witnessed her struggles through changing seasons, had seen her thin frame nearly collapse that first winter before she learned to properly smoke meat and store provisions, had observed her determination as she taught herself skills that men in her culture typically performed. Most striking was her silence. Even alone, she rarely spoke aloud. His grandfather would have recognized her suffering. Some wounds leave no blood, he would say, but cut deepest of all. 3 days prior, Nako had finally approached the edge of her clearing, allowing himself to be seen. He expected the rifle's aim, had anticipated it. What surprised him was the lack of fear in her eyes. Wariness, yes. Determination, certainly. But not the terror white women typically displayed upon seeing an Apache man. He touched the small carving in his pouch, a wooden bird he had crafted over many evenings. An offering he would leave, expecting nothing in return. The beginning of a language between strangers when words fail. The woman entered her chicken coop, emerging moments later with a small basket of eggs. Her movements were efficient, practiced. She had built a life here from nothing. This Nakohe understood and respected, above all else. He withdrew silently as she returned indoors. Later, when she ventured to the creek for water, he would place the small wooden bird on the stump where she split logs, not close enough to her dwelling to cause alarm, just visible enough to be intentional. Communication required patience. This lesson his grandfather had taught him well. The sun climbed higher, As Nakuhei made his way down the ridge to where he had hidden the rabbit, caught in his snare at dawn, he would skin it here, away from her sight. The meat would be his next offering, left on the same stump, fresh meat, to supplement her dwindling winter stores. Small step, careful trust. The way of approaching any wild creature, wounded by the world. His path back to his own small shelter would take the remainder of the day, a cave dwelling 3 ridges distant, modified with woven mats and stone hearth, remote enough to be secure, yet close enough to observe the cabin valley, his existence suspended between Apache ways and the encroaching settler world. Much like the woman, he lived in the space between belonging. The wooden bird appeared on the stump like a visitation from another world. Margaret approached it cautiously, rifle ready, half expecting an ambush that never came. The carving was exquisite, a small chickadee with details so fine she could see individual feathers. She recognized the craftsmanship of the Apache man, the same hands that had left rabbit meat and repaired her fence while keeping his distance. For 3 days the bird remained untouched on the stump. Each morning Margaret stepped onto her porch, coffee cup warming her palms, and regarded the offering from across the yard. The small gesture disrupted 7 years of carefully constructed isolation. Accepting it meant acknowledging another human being's existence in her carefully ordered world. On the 4th morning she left 4 freshly baked biscuits, wrapped in cloth, beside the bird. They disappeared before noon. Margaret sat at her small table that evening, working by lantern light with her bone needle, mending a tear in her apron. The needle had been necessary craftsmanship, one of her first attempts at making her own tools after her store-bought needles had broken. Boston Margaret would have been appalled at its crude appearance compared to fine steel sewing implements. Arizona Margaret saw only its functionality, the way the polished bone slid smoothly through fabric, carrying thread behind it like a whisper of possibility. 2 days later she found the biscuit cloth, returned, washed clean and folded precisely, with a small bundle of herbs beside it. She recognized them from her limited knowledge of local plants, feverfew for headaches, which had plagued her the previous week. The realization that he had noticed her discomfort from a distance was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Their wordless exchange continued through the changing moon. A carved wooden spoon replaced her broken one. Wild honey in a hollowed gourd. Each gift practical, each responding to a need she hadn't voiced aloud. In return, she left small offerings of her own. Extra cornbread, a knitted wool scarf when the mornings grew colder, a carefully drawn map of water sources she'd discovered in the surrounding hills. One morning she awoke to the sound of hammers. Peering through her window, heart pounding, she saw him repairing her chicken coop, reinforcing the walls against predators. She watched through a gap in her curtains, studying him properly for the first time. He worked with efficiency and purpose, his movements fluid. His black hair hung in 2 braids, and the lines of his face showed both youth and weathering. Perhaps 30 winters, she guessed. His clothing combined traditional Apache elements with pieces adapted from settler culture, buckskin leggings and a faded blue cotton shirt that had seen considerable mending. Margaret's fingers unconsciously clutched her bone needle as she watched him work. She had sewn herself into a life of isolation, each stitch a reinforcement of her vow never to depend on another human being. Yet here was someone who asked nothing, demanded nothing, expected nothing in return for his kindness. When he finished the repairs and gathered his tools, Margaret found herself moving to the door before conscious thought took hold. Standing on her porch, she raised her hand in a small, tentative wave, the first deliberate acknowledgement of his presence. He paused, clearly surprised, then returned the gesture with a slight nod before disappearing into the tree line. That night, Margaret dreamed of Boston ballrooms where dancers moved in silent patterns, their lips forming words she couldn't hear. She awoke with a strange ache in her throat, as though her unused voice strained against its confinement. In the weeks that followed, a rhythm emerged. He would arrive at dawn, working on various improvements around her property. A new water barrel, reinforced roof supports, a small vegetable garden plot cleared and ready for spring planting, always departing before dusk. Always maintaining a respectful distance. Margaret found herself anticipating these visits, watching from windows or the porch as he worked. Sometimes she would intentionally work outside as well, hanging laundry, tending her chickens, gathering kindling, a careful dance of two solitary people sharing space without words. For the first time in 7 years, Margaret realized she was no longer alone. The first frost came early that year, painting the ground white and stiffening the laundry. Margaret had left to dry overnight. She consulted her almanac over morning coffee, frowning at the predictions that had proven inaccurate for the 3rd year running. Eastern weather wisdom rarely held true in these mountains. Her own notations in the margins had proven more reliable. Observations of pine cone openings, animal behavior, and cloud formations that locals would have recognized as harbingers. Early frost means early snow, her nearest neighbor had warned before passing away 2 winters prior. The memory sent her to the woodpile, mentally calculating her supplies. 4 cords stacked against the cabin wall, perhaps enough for a mild winter. But if the almanac's cold temperature predictions held true despite its timing errors, she would need more. The crack of an axe split the morning silence before she could retrieve her own. Margaret stepped onto the porch to find the Apache man already at work, systematically reducing a fallen pine to manageable pieces. He acknowledged her with a nod, but continued working, his rhythm unbroken. Margaret hesitated, then returned inside for her gloves. When she emerged again, she began stacking the cut pieces without comment. They worked in tandem until midday, the pile growing steadily, their breath visible in the increasingly cold air. When they finished, he gestured toward the northern ridgeline, then made a sweeping motion with his hand, while whistling a soft, wind-like sound. Margaret understood immediately a storm approaching. She nodded her thanks, then surprised herself by mimicking his gesture and pointing to her cabin, then to him, followed by a questioning tilt of her head. The invitation was clear despite her silence. Would he share a meal before departing? His momentary stillness revealed his surprise. Then, with careful deliberation, he nodded once. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she ladled venison stew into 2 bowls. 7 years since she had served food to another person. 7 years since she had sat across a table from anyone. The domesticity of the act unearthed memories she had believed safely buried. Dinner parties in Boston, servants moving quietly among elegantly dressed guests. Charles at the head of the table, his charm masking the cruelty she alone witnessed in private moments. She placed the bowls on her small table, then hesitated, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the indoor space. Changing course, she carried them to the porch instead, where she had positioned a bench the previous summer for evening reading light. He joined her there, accepting the bowl with a nod of thanks. They ate in silence, the steaming food warming them against the increasingly bitter wind. Dark clouds gathered above the distant peaks, confirming his weather prediction. When they finished, he produced a small leather pouch from within his shirt and offered it to her. Inside, Margaret found pine nuts, carefully shelled and ready for consumption. The hours such preparation must have taken made the gift significant. By sunset, the first snowflakes began to fall, large, wet flakes that quickly accumulated on the frozen ground. The Apache man gathered his few tools, clearly intending to leave despite the worsening weather. Margaret stepped forward, concern overriding her habitual caution. She gestured to the thickening snow, then toward the barn, raising her eyebrows in question. He studied her face for a long moment, perhaps seeking the true intent behind the offer. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, for he nodded once more and followed as she led the way to the small structure where she kept her chickens and stored tools. The barn wasn't meant for human habitation, but it provided shelter from the elements. Margaret showed him where dry hay was stacked, then hurried back to the cabin for blankets and her spare lantern. By the time she returned, he had arranged a neat sleeping area in the corner farthest from the door, respecting her property while accepting her hospitality. That night, Margaret lay awake, listening to the storm's fury. Snow rattled against her windows, and wind moaned through the pine trees surrounding her homestead. For the first time in years, the sounds didn't fill her with dread. The knowledge of another human presence, even separated by the distance between cabin and barn, changed something fundamental in her experience of isolation. Before sleep claimed her, she realized she had been humming softly to herself, a lullaby her mother had sung when she was small. The sound of her own voice, however quiet, seemed a strange and tentative awakening. The storm raged for 3 days, piling snow in drifts that reached the bottom of Margaret's windows. By the second morning, concern for her darn guest overcame ingrained caution. She trudged through knee-deep snow, carrying a covered pot of still warm oatmeal, half expecting to find him gone despite the blizzard. He was there, though, efficiently reorganizing her tool wall according to function, rather than the haphazard arrangement she had maintained. A small fire burned in the metal bucket she used for boiling chicken feed, properly ventilated through a clever arrangement of stovepipe pieces she hadn't known could fit together. If he was surprised by her appearance, he showed no sign, simply nodded in greeting and cleared a space on her workbench for the food. As he ate, Margaret took inventory of the changes. Split kindling stacked by size, her collection of nails sorted into jars, a broken rake handle mended with sinew binding stronger than the original wood. The barn looked better than it had since she'd acquired the property. She found herself nodding with approval before retreating to the relative safety of her cabin. By the third day, they had established a wordless routine. She brought food twice daily. He kept the paths between cabin, barn, and outhouse shoveled clear. They worked separately but in awareness of each other, she baking bread and preserving the last of her fall vegetables, he repairing tools and reinforcing the barn's weather seals. When the storm finally broke, leaving a crystalline blue sky and a transformed white landscape, Margaret felt an unexpected pang at the thought of his departure. Standing on her porch, watching the sun glint blindingly off snow-covered pines, she heard his approach before seeing him. His footsteps crunched through the crusted snow as he carried his few belongings from the barn. He paused at the bottom of her porch steps, clearly preparing to take his leave. The moment stretched between them, filled with the Margaret found herself turning abruptly and entering her cabin. She emerged moments later with 2 clay mugs, steam rising from each. The coffee was a luxury she rationed carefully, saved for mornings when the isolation pressed too heavily, or when her spirits needed particular fortification. She had never before shared it with another soul in this place. She held out one mug, the gesture unmistakable in its intent. After a moment's hesitation, he set down his bundle and climbed the steps. He accepted the offered cup with a slight bow of his head, a gesture of respect that contained none of the condescension Charles had shown when accepting anything from female hands. They stood side by side on the porch, watching the sun climb higher as they sipped the bitter brew. The silence between them had transformed from wary to comfortable, the shared warmth of the mugs a tangible connection in the frigid morning. When their cups were empty, Margaret surprised herself again. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough from disuse, barely above a whisper. He turned to her, eyes widening slightly at the sound of her voice. For a moment he seemed to search for words in a language, perhaps grown as rusty as her own. "Strong woman," he finally said, the English words careful and deliberate. "Good heart." The simple phrase, free from flattery or agenda, struck Margaret with unexpected force. When had anyone last acknowledged her strength rather than her compliance? When had a man last spoken to her heart rather than her appearance or utility? "The storm," she began, then paused, gathering words that felt foreign on her tongue. "Will you return? When the sun crosses the sky twice more." He nodded, a smile touching the corners of his eye. "I return," he affirmed, then added something in his native tongue before translating, "When sun crosses sky twice more." As he departed, following a trail only he could discern through the deep snow, Margaret remained on the porch until his figure disappeared among the distant trees. The empty mug in her hand retained its warmth for several minutes afterward. She traced its rim with one finger, remembering the trader who had sold her the pair years ago. "One for you, one for company," he had said with a wink. She had purchased them despite knowing there would never be company at her table. A small act of defiance against her self-imposed isolation, or perhaps, though she hadn't recognized it then, an act of hope. Margaret hadn't planned on going to town until spring thaw. Her supplies were carefully rationed to last through winter's isolation, each jar of preserved vegetables and sack of flour accounted for in her meticulous inventory. But the coffee pot that morning revealed grounds sufficient for only 3 more brewings, and the memory of shared coffee on her porch made the shortage suddenly unacceptable. She hitched her elderly mare to the small sleigh, packing trading goods, hand-knitted socks, beeswax candles, and dried herbs that would supplement her limited currency. The 10-mile journey to Copper Creek would consume most of daylight, leaving little margin for delay if she wished to return before dark. The old canteen hung from her saddle horn, a habit from her early days when she'd once become lost, returning from town and spent a cold night huddled beneath a rocky outcropping. The water inside was already half frozen despite the cloth wrapping, much like the landscape through which she traveled, partially frozen, suspended between states. Copper Creek had grown since her last visit 6 months prior. A new mercantile competed with Jansen's general store, and the saloon sported fresh paint and glass windows. 3 new houses stood half-completed at the town's edge, testament to the silver vein discovered in the nearby foothills. Margaret tethered her mare behind Jansen's, avoiding the busier hitching posts along the main street. She adjusted her woolen scarf to partially cover her face, not from cold alone but from the prospect of interaction. The comfortable silence established with the Apache man hadn't prepared her for the cacophony of town voices. The bell above Jansen's door announced her entry. The store's warmth after the frigid journey made her cheeks tingle painfully as she unwound her scarf. Mr. Jansen himself stood behind the counter, his grey beard neatly trimmed, his eyes brightening with recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore? Wasn't expecting you before spring." Margaret nodded in acknowledgement, still unused to verbal exchanges. "Coffee," she managed after a moment, "and salt." She moved through the store efficiently, selecting only necessities plus the coffee, a luxury that had suddenly become essential. At the ammunition display, she paused. Her rifle cartridges were running low after a winter of hunting for sustenance. "I wouldn't linger outside town after dark these days, Mrs. Whitmore," Jansen said, following her gaze. "Lot of talk about Apache raiding parties hitting ranches north of here." Margaret's hand froze over the cartridge box. "Recent trouble? William's place got hit last week. Burned the barn, ran off half his cattle." Jansen leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "Sheriffs formed a militia with some of the miners. They're offering $20 for Apache scalps, $50 for a war chief's." The bile rose in Margaret's throat. She managed a non-committal noise, her eyes now fixed on the crude notice nailed beside the ammunition display. "Indians beware, justice comes swift to savages." "Terrible business," a new voice interjected. Margaret turned to find Sheriff Dawson standing in the doorway, his silver star catching the lantern light. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with the tip of his hat. "Long ride from your place in this weather." "Sheriff," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Been meaning to check on you out there. Isolated homesteads are vulnerable." His eyes were kind enough, though the rifle slung across his back undermined the neighborly concern. Williams wasn't the only one hit. Marshall's trading post and the Beckman place too. "I keep to myself," Margaret said. "No livestock worth stealing. With respect, ma'am. These aren't ordinary raids. Something's got the Apache riled up. They're hitting places they'd normally avoid." He stepped closer, voice lowering. "You should consider staying in town until this blows over." The suggestion sent a wave of panic through her chest. Return to civilization, to crowded streets and prying questions, to men's watchful eyes. "My home is there," she said simply, finality in her tone. Sheriff Dawson sighed. "At least take precautions. Bar your doors at night. Keep that rifle loaded." He glanced at her purchases, And if you see any sign of Indians, any sign at all, you ride straight here, day or night." Margaret completed her transaction quickly, eager to escape the stifling atmosphere. As she loaded her purchases into her sleigh, she noticed a group of men gathering outside the salon. Their loud voices carried across the street, boasts about tracking skills and marksmanship, punctuated by crude remarks about Indian hunting. One man, taller than the others with a red bandana around his neck, caught her watching. "Ma'am," he called, peeling away from the group. "Jenkins, militia captain." His breath reeked of whiskey as he approached. "Sheriff mentioned you're out past Broken Spur Creek. Dangerous country for a woman alone." Margaret tightened the straps on her packages. "I manage." "I bet you do." His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl with familiar revulsion. "We'll be patrolling out that way soon. Could stop in. Make sure you're protected." The double meaning hung in the cold air between them. Margaret climbed onto her sleigh without response, her hands steady despite the churning fear. As she turned her mare toward home, the canteen knocked against her thigh, its hollow sound an echo of the emptiness opening within her. Nakohe was in danger. And now, because of him, so was she. Margaret had rehearsed the words all morning, pacing her small cabin as snow melted from the roof in steady drips. The rhythm matched her practiced phrases, halting, then flowing, then halting again. 7 years of near silence had left her vocabulary atrophied, like a limb too long immobilized. "Danger," she whispered to the empty room. "Men hunting. Town militia. Bounties." The words sounded inadequate, unable to convey the hatred she'd witnessed in Jenkins' eyes, or the bloodlust poorly disguised as justice. How could mere language warn Nakohe of what awaited him if discovered? By midday, the patch of earth beside her woodpile had thawed enough to reveal dark soil. Margaret knelt there with a charred stick from her fireplace, drawing with the precision she once applied to watercolor landscapes in Boston parlor. First the mountains, then the creek, her cabin marked with a small square, the town rendered as a cluster of rectangles. Then X marks along the likely patrol routes Sheriff Dawson had mentioned. She worked with grim focus, ignoring the cold seeping through her skirts and the dirt embedding beneath her fingernails. Charles would have been appalled at the sight, his elegant wife kneeling in mud. The thought brought a grim smile to her lips as she added final details to her crude map. The sun was beginning its western descent when she spotted movement at the tree line. Nakohe emerged from the forest, carrying a string of rabbits, fresh meat to supplement her winter stores. He moved with easy confidence until he registered her kneeling position and tense posture. Margaret rose, wiping her hands on her apron as he approached. The usual calm exchange of nods felt woefully insufficient, given what she needed to convey. He offered the rabbits, but she shook her head, gesturing urgently to the dirt drawing. "Men," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "From town. Hunting Apache." His expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted, awareness that hadn't been present before. He crouched beside the drawing, studying it with the focused attention of one accustomed to reading landscapes as text. "Bounties," Margaret continued, pointing to the X marks. $50 for war chiefs, 20 for others. She couldn't bring herself to say scalps, the word too grotesque for her tongue. Nakohe nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his features. "Raids," he said simply. "North Ranches." "Yes. Williams Place. Marshall's trading post." "Not my people," he said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. "Different band. From mountains." He pointed to the northwestern edge of her map. "They follow war chief, who lost family to soldiers." Margaret absorbed this information, realizing how little she knew of the complex tribal politics beyond her isolated existence. "Town doesn't care which Apache," she said. "All the same to them." A shadow passed over Nakohe's face. Not fear, but a resigned recognition. "Always same story," he agreed. "White men see only enemy." He studied the map again. adding details with his finger, hidden trails, water sources, lookout points she'd never known existed despite years on the land. His knowledge of the territory was intimate, ancestral. "You should go," Margaret said, the words painful as they left her lips. "Far from here, Mexico, perhaps." Nakohe looked at her then, truly looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You alone then," he said. Not a question, the simple observation laid bare the truth she'd been avoiding. Yes, she would be alone again. The brief respite from isolation would end. The small comforts of shared coffee, of another human presence, of someone who saw her strength rather than her solitude, all would vanish with his necessary departure. "I survived before," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "Survive is not live," he replied, wisdom in the careful English. Margaret looked away, unable to face the truth in his words. Survival had been her only goal for so long that the possibility of more seemed a dangerous indulgence. "Jenkins," she said, pointing to one of the X marks closest to her property. "Militia leader. He knows of my cabin, spoke of visiting." She couldn't keep the revulsion from her voice. "Narco," expression hardened. "When? Soon? Days, perhaps." She gestured to the map again. "They patrol here first, then circuit brings them this direction." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the dirt, drawing. Narco stood, decision evident in his posture. "I return tonight," he said. "After dark." Margaret wanted to protest. Night travel was dangerous even without militia patrols, but she recognized the necessity. He needed to warn others who might be in danger, to gather information beyond her limited knowledge. "Be careful," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He nodded once, then spoke in Apache before translating, eyes open, steps silent. As he disappeared back into the forest, Margaret remained beside the dirt map, its details already beginning to blur as the evening dew settled on the soil. Night fell with the sudden completeness of mountain darkness. Margaret stoked the fireplace to blazing life, its heat a barrier against both the physical cold and the chill of foreboding that had settled in her chest since returning from town. She had spent the afternoon in restless preparation, checking her rifle, securing windows, positioning furniture to block the door if necessary. The knock, when it came, was so soft she nearly missed it beneath the fire's crackling. She approached the door cautiously, rifle in hand, before recognizing Nakahi's distinctive pattern. 2 gentle taps, pause, 1 final tap. He entered like a shadow, bringing the thaunt of pine and winter air with him. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his hearth came in visible puffs that dissipated in the cabin's warmth. This was the first time she had invited him inside her dwelling, her sanctuary, and the significance hung unspoken between them. "No patrols tonight," he said, warming his hands before the stone fireplace. "Snow keeps them close to whiskey barrels." Margaret set water to boil, measuring precious coffee beans with deliberate care. "How long before they come this direction?" 3 days, maybe 4. Jenkins spoke truth about patrolling. Nakohe accepted the steaming cup she offered. "I followed militia scout. Heard plans." The ease with which he had tracked the militia and eavesdropped undetected should have frightened her. Instead, Margaret found herself grateful for his skills, the same abilities that allowed him to survive in this unforgiving territory. They sat before the fire, the dancing flames illuminating their faces in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The domesticity of the scene struck Margaret with unexpected force. How long since she had shared her hearth with another soul? The simple act of sitting beside someone in companionable silence felt both foreign and achingly familiar. "You have family?" she asked, suddenly surprising herself with the personal question. Narco stared into the flames. "Once. Mother died when I was 12 summers. Father returned to Mexico. After, sister married into Desert People Band." His voice carried no self-pity, only statement of fact. "Now no tribe claims me. 2 Mexican for Apache, 2 Apache for Mexicans. A person between worlds," Margaret murmured. He glanced at her, recognition kindling in his eyes. "Like you." The observation struck her with its simple accuracy. She too existed between worlds. no longer the Boston society woman, yet not fully belonging to this frontier existence either. "I had a family in Boston," she said, the words emerging easier than expected. "Parents, younger sister, good standing in society." She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "I married young, a banker named Charles Whitmore." The name felt strange on her tongue after years of deliberate forgetting. Nakohe listened silently, his attention a steady presence that encouraged rather than demanded. "He was cruel," she continued, "not with fists, with words, with control, with betrayal." Each phrase emerged like stones long carried, now finally set down. "When I discovered his affairs and confronted him publicly, his family gave me a choice: disappear quietly or watch my father's business destroyed." The fire popped and shifted, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, wind moaned through pine branches, a lonely counterpoint to her words. "I haven't spoken to a man in years," she whispered, the confession emerging from some deep, hidden place within her. "Not until you." Nakohe remained still, absorbing her words with quiet dignity. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he responded in Apache, before translating, "Words can wound deeper than arrows. Silence becomes shield." Margaret nodded, emotion tightening her throat. He understood without explanation, without judgment, the protective cocoon of silence she had wrapped around herself, the safety found in solitude. "Your name," he said after a moment. "Not Whitmore?" "Margaret," she replied, reclaiming her identity with the simple syllables. "Margaret Harrington was my birth name." "Margaret," he repeated carefully, giving each syllable its due weight. Then he offered his own gift. "I am Nakohe. It means bear in my mother's language." The exchange of names felt ceremonial in the firelight. A trust, extended and accepted. Margaret found herself studying his profile, the strong lines of his face softened by firelight. There was a quiet dignity in his bearing that reminded her of no one from her previous life. "The militia," she said, reluctantly returning to the danger at hand. "What will you do?" "What we both must do," Nakohe replied, his eyes meeting hers with sudden intensity. "Decide if this place," he gestured to the cabin around them, "is worth dying for." The question hung in the warm air between them, unanswerable yet demanding response. Margaret looked around at the small home she had built from nothing, the independence she had carved from wilderness and silence. For the first time she wondered if there might be something worth more than solitary survival. Dawn arrived with a hesitant blush of pink across snow-laden clouds. Margaret stood at her window, the cracked porcelain teacup warming her palms. Its delicate floral pattern and gold rim seemed absurdly out of place in her rough-hewn cabin, a fragment of Boston elegance that had somehow survived the journey west and 7 years of frontier life. Behind her, Nakohe slept on a bedroll near the dying embers of the fireplace. He had intended to leave before first light, but the snow had intensified throughout the night, blanketing the world in treacherous white. Without discussion, Margaret had arranged blankets for him by the fire, maintaining a careful distance that respected both propriety and her lingering wariness. Watching him now, his face relaxed in sleep, dark hair loosened from its customary braids, Margaret felt a strange tightening in her chest. The feeling was both foreign and distantly familiar, like discovering a room in her heart she had believed permanently sealed. The teacup in her hands had belonged to her grandmother, passed down with instructions to use it only for occasions of significance. In Boston, it had graced formal teas with potential suitors, and later, tense breakfasts with Charles when his mask of charm would occasionally slip. The hairline crack had appeared during the journey west, a fitting metaphor for her own fractured life. Now it held pine needle tea, a frontier substitute Nakohe had taught her to brew during yesterday's conversation. The earthy, slightly resinous flavor couldn't be further from imported Darjeeling, yet she found it oddly satisfying. Nakohe stirred, then sat up with the immediate alertness of one accustomed to danger. His eyes found hers across the room, and a moment of silent acknowledgement passed between them. "Snow deep," he observed, moving to the window beside her. "Covers tracks and keeps the militia in town," Margaret added, offering him the second cup of pine tea she had prepared. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a momentary contact that sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. Margaret stepped back quickly, confused by her reaction. 7 years without human touch had left her unprepared for even such casual contact. 3 days until Jenkins leads patrol this direction, Nako said, seemingly unaware of her discomfort. Path south to Mexico requires preparation. Mexico, Margaret repeated, the word both exotic and daunting. You've decided to go then? Decided we must consider it. His correction was gentle, but unmistakable. This place not safe for either of us now. Margaret turned back to the window, staring at the transformed landscape. The familiar contours of her homestead lay buried beneath snow, rendering the known world strange and new. Just as this conversation was pushing her beyond the carefully constructed boundaries of her existence. I built this place, she said finally. Every repair, every improvement, my hands, my work. She traced the crack in her teacup with one finger. It's not much, but it's mine. Truly mine. Nakohe nodded, understanding in his eyes. Apache believe land belongs to no one. We belong to land. A convenient philosophy when you're being driven from your territory. Margaret observed with unexpected sharpness. Rather than taking offense, Nakohe smiled. A rare, transformative expression that softened the weathered planes of his face. True words, he acknowledged, but still wisdom in them. The smile did something peculiar to Margaret's composure, disrupting the careful distance she maintained. She looked away, focusing on the familiar objects of her cabin. The handmade quilt on her narrow bed, the shelf of precious books, the cast-iron cookware hanging from ceiling hooks. What would I be without this place? She asked, the question emerging unbidden. Who would I be? Same woman, Nakohe said with quiet certainty. Strong heart isn't changed with changing land. Margaret set down her teacup, its familiar crack a reminder of resilience. I'm afraid, she admitted, the confession barely audible. Not of Jenkins and his men, of unknown paths. Fear speaks truth, Nakohe replied, echoing his words from the previous night. Listen, then decide. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the pine and smoke scent that clung to his clothing. Margaret remained still, caught between ingrained caution and a new, insistent longing for human connection. Sometimes I fear I'll die without being touched again, she whispered, the words emerging from some unguarded chamber of her heart. Nakohe's eyes darkened with understanding, with deliberate slowness, telegraphing each movement to allow retreat. He raised his hand toward her face. Margaret held her breath as his fingers hovered near her cheek, giving her every opportunity to step away. She didn't. The gentle brush of his fingertips against her skin broke a dam within her. Tears she had refused to shed for 7 years welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the simple, overwhelming reality of human touch, freely given and received. Nakohe smiled, understanding rather than pitying, and with infinite gentleness, he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative, questioning a beginning rather than a demand. When he drew back, Margaret remained motionless, eyes closed, absorbing the seismic shift in her carefully ordered world. When ready, he murmured, not before. The snow melted rapidly under an unseasonable warm spell, leaving the ground treacherously muddy and Margaret's thoughts equally unsettled. For 2 days following their kiss, she had avoided Nakohe despite his continued presence on her property. He seemed to understand her need for distance, focusing on reinforcing her chicken coop and repairing winter damage to the barn roof, without attempting to breach the silence that had descended between them. Alone in her cabin, Margaret pulled the cedar chest from beneath her bed. The box had been her mother's, its lid carved with intertwining roses and vines, incongruously elegant amid her frontier possessions. She rarely opened it. The contents were too potent, memories too sharp. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside lay carefully preserved fragments of her former life, Her sister Elizabeth's letters, their edges worn from repeated reading, a small daguerreotype of her parents, the ivory hair comb she'd worn at her wedding, and beneath it all a leather-bound volume of poetry Charles had given her during courtship, before his true nature emerged. She lifted the book, its weight familiar in her hands. Inside the cover, his inscription remained, "To my delicate rose, whose beauty shall forever grace our home." The flowery sentiment now rang hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what followed, how swiftly admiration had turned to possession, appreciation to control. Charles had hated her reading poetry, filling your head with romantic nonsense he'd scoffed. Later, she understood his true objection, the inner life it nurtured, the part of herself he couldn't possess. Margaret closed the book with a decisive snap and returned it to the chest. What was she doing excavating these buried hurt? The answer lay in Nakohi's kiss, in the frightening possibility it represented. For 7 years she had defined herself by what she had escaped, building her identity around independence and isolation. The tender gesture threatened, that carefully constructed cell. A noise from outside drew her to the window. Nakohi stood at the chopping block, splitting logs with efficient strokes. Watching his steady movements, Margaret pressed her fingertips to her lips, remembering the gentle pressure of his mouth against hers, not demanding or conquering, as Charles's kisses had been, rather offering and questioning. "He is not Charles," she whispered to the empty room, the obvious truth somehow profound in its simplicity. Still, fear coiled in her stomach. She had been wrong before, catastrophically wrong, in her assessment of a man's character. What guarantee existed that she wouldn't err again? Margaret closed the cedar chest, sliding it back under her bed, but the memories it contained remained present. Charles's voice echoed in her mind, dredging up cruel comments about her appearance, her intellect, her worth, how easily he had dismantled her confidence, piece by piece, until she doubted her own perceptions. She moved to her small mirror, studying her reflection with critical eyes. The woman who gazed back bore little resemblance to the pampered Boston debutante. Sun and wind had weathered her fair skin. Once auburn hair now showed strands of premature silver. Lines etched the corners of her eyes and mouth. Not the gentle marks of laughter, but the deeper grooves of solitude and survival. Charles had prized her beauty above all else, treating her as an ornament to display and control. When that beauty began to fade under the strain of his emotional cruelty, his contempt had been absolute. What did Nakahe see when he looked at her? The question plagued her as she moved about her daily tasks, distracted and unsettled. By evening, the emotional turmoil drove her outdoors despite the muddy conditions. She found Nakahe at the edge of her property, securing a loose section of fencing. He straightened at her approach, his expression carefully neutral. "Jenkins and militia ride out tomorrow," he said without preamble. "Scout brought word." Margaret nodded, absorbing this information. "How long before they reach here?" 2 days if weather holds." He gestured to the western sky where clouds gathered. Rain might delay them. The practical exchange steadied her, providing firm ground amid her emotional quagmire. This was familiar territory, assessment of threat, planning for survival. "I've been thinking about Mexico," she said, surprising herself with the admission. Nako's gaze sharpened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "I need to know," Margaret began, then faltered, searching for words. "The other day when you—" The kiss he supplied simply, neither apologizing for nor pressing the advantage of the memory. "Yes." Margaret took a steadying breath. "I need to know your meaning in it." Nako considered her question with the deliberate care he applied to all things. "Meaning was honor," he finally said. "For your strength. Your words touched my spirit." "Not pity then," Margaret pressed, needing certainty. Not seeing a broken woman needing comfort. Something like surprise flickered across his features. "Broken?" He shook his head slowly. "I see woman who survived, who built life from nothing, who stands tall against fear." His eyes held hers with unwavering directness. Not broken, tested by fire, like good blade. The simple assessment, delivered without flattery or agenda, penetrated Margaret's defenses more effectively than any elaborate declaration could have. Tears pricked behind her eyes, not from sorrow but from the shocking relief of being truly seen. "I'm afraid," she whispered, echoing her earlier confession. Nakahu nodded. "Fear is wise teacher," he said. "But poor master." The thundering of hooves broke the morning stillness, sending chickens scattering in panic. Margaret dropped the laundry she'd been hanging and rushed inside for her rifle. Through the window she counted 3 riders approaching, the lead figure unmistakably Sheriff Dawson, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. "Nakahu," she whispered, urgently. He had been repairing her leaking roof, but had already disappeared, his instincts for danger as sharp as any wild creature's. Margaret smoothed her apron, tucked stray hairs beneath her kerchief, and stepped onto her porch, rifle held casually but visibly at her side. Sheriff Dawson raised his hand in greeting as they approached, the tarnished badge on his chest catching dull light. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called, dismounting with a grunt that betrayed his advancing years. "Fine spring morning." "Sheriff," she acknowledged, nodding to the strangers who remained mounted. "What brings you out this way?" "Patrol and welfare check," Dawson replied, removing his hat. "These here are Miller and Thompson, volunteered for the militia." He gestured to the men, who regarded Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "Thought we'd make sure you're faring all right out here, what with the Apache troubles." Margaret maintained her neutral expression through practiced discipline. "Very thoughtful. As you can see, I'm managing fine." The older of the 2 riders, Miller, she presumed, squinted at the repaired sections of fence and the freshly mended roof. "Looks like you've had help recently, ma'am." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I've learned many skills living alone, Mr. Miller." "That's so." The younger man, Thompson, swung down from his horse. He couldn't be more than 20, with a patchy attempt at a beard and a militia badge crudely fashioned from tin. "Mighty fine work for a lady's hands." Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. "Any unusual sightings to report, Mrs. Whitmore? Smoke signals, strange tracks, missing livestock?" "Nothing to report," Margaret replied, "though I'd be obliged to know where Jenkins might be. He mentioned stopping by when I saw him in town." A look passed between the men that raised Margaret's internal alarm. "Jenkins and his group are checking the northern section today," Dawson said. "Should be through here by tomorrow or the day after." Thompson had wandered toward her woodpile, examining the precisely split logs with unconcealed skepticism. "Sheriff, these cuts are fresh, made with a proper axe, not a hatchet like most women use." Margaret's grip tightened on her rifle. "I prefer efficiency over convention, Mr. Thompson." Ma'am Miller called from where he'd dismounted to examine something near her barn. "These look mighty like moccasin prints to my eye." Sheriff Dawson joined him, bending stiffly to study the partial footprint in the mud. When he straightened, his expression had hardened. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think we'd better take a look inside your cabin." "You have no cause," Margaret protested, moving to block her doorway. "Harboring hostiles is a hanging offense," Thompson said, his young face suddenly ugly with importance, "even for a woman." "I'm not harboring anyone," Margaret stated firmly, "and you have no authority to enter my home without cause." Sheriff Dawson sighed, fingers brushing his tarnished badge. "Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret, I'm trying to help you here. If Jenkins finds evidence an Apache's been around, he won't be as understanding as me." Understanding? Margaret's voice took on an edge she hadn't used since Boston. "Is that what you call bringing armed men to intimidate a woman living peacefully on her own land?" "Now see here," Miller began, but Dawson raised a hand to silence him. "We're not here to cause trouble," the sheriff said, "but there's been 3 raids in 2 months. People are scared, and scared people do ugly things. I'm just trying to keep the peace." "By hunting people for bounty?" Margaret couldn't keep the disgust from her voice. Thompson's hand moved to his pistol. "Sounds like Indian lover talk to me, Sheriff." Dawson shot him a warning look. "Stand down, Thompson. Mrs. Whitmore is a respected homesteader." He turned back to Margaret, his voice lowering. I'd advise cooperation, ma'am. Makes things easier all around. Margaret recognized the implicit threat beneath his reasonable tone. The same veneer of civilization that had masked Boston's cruelties now stretched thin over frontier brutality. Very well, she conceded, stepping aside. Though I protest this invasion of my privacy. The men spent 20 minutes searching her small cabin, overturning her bedding and peering into cupboards. Margaret stood rigidly by the door, maintaining an outward calm that belied her thundering heart. Had Nako left any trace of his presence? Would they recognize the fresh coffee beans as too plentiful for a single woman's consumption? What's this? Thompson emerged from behind her stove, holding a small carved animal, a bear Nako had made during their evening conversations. Margaret's mind raced. Traded with a Mexican peddler last fall, she improvised. For eggs and butter. Sheriff Dawson examined the carving, turning it over in his weathered hands. Something in his eyes suggested he didn't believe her, but after a moment he handed it back. Fine craftsmanship, he remarked, neutrally. When they finally departed, with warnings to stay vigilant and promises that Jenkins would check in soon, Margaret remained on her porch until the dust from their horses had settled. Only then did she allow her knees to buckle, sinking onto the rough-hewn bench as reaction set in. "They will return," came Niko's voice from the shadows of the barn doorway. With Jenkins, Margaret nodded, too drained for surprise at his sudden reappearance. "Yes, and next time, they won't be satisfied with looking." Niko moved to sit beside her, close but not touching. "Time grows short," he said simply. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a spring storm approaching from the west. Like the danger they faced, it was inevitable, unstoppable, and growing closer by the hour. "They're coming." Margaret's voice cut through the early morning quiet as she burst through her cabin door. Dawn had barely broken, but she'd spotted the distant dust cloud while drawing water from the well riders approaching from the direction of town. Nako immediately abandoned the horse he'd been saddling behind the barn. They had spent the previous day in careful preparation after the sheriff's visit, gathering essential supplies and discussing possible routes south. Now time had run out. "How many?" he asked, joining her at the cabin. "At least 4, maybe 5. Margaret's hands worked swiftly, gathering the small bundle of provisions she'd prepared. "Jenkins will be among them." Nako moved to the window, studying the approaching riders. His expression remained impassive, but Margaret had learned to read the subtle tension in his shoulders, the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Too late to run," he concluded. "They would see us on open ground." Margaret's mind raced through their limited options. The barn offered no real concealment. The surrounding forest was too distant to reach undetected. Her gaze fell on the faded rug in her kitchen corner, the one covering her root cellar. "Here," she said decisively, rolling back the rug to reveal the rough trapdoor beneath. "My first winter, I dug this for storing vegetables. It's small, but—" Nako nodded, immediately understanding. He helped her lift the heavy door, revealing the earthen pit below, barely 5 feet square and 4 feet deep, its walls reinforced with scavenged boards and river stones. Root vegetables still hung in mesh bags from the ceiling, their earthy scent rising from the cool darkness. "I will fight if necessary," he said, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "Not hide while you face danger." Margaret shook her head firmly. "They will kill you without question or trial." She gripped his arm, surprising herself with the intensity of her touch. "Please, I can handle Jenkins and his men." The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, punctuated by male voices. Time had run out. After a moment's hesitation, Nakohe pressed something into her palm, a small carved bear, twin to the one Thompson had discovered. "Courage," he said simply, then lowered himself into the cramped space. Margaret replaced the trapdoor, arranged the rug, and pushed her heavy wooden table partially over the concealed entrance. Her heart pounded painfully as she smoothed her hair and apron, then moved to the cabin door just as the riders arrived in her yard. Jenkins sat astride a large sorrel gelding, his red bandana visible from a distance. Flanking him were Thompson and Miller from the previous day's visit, along with a 4th man, Margaret didn't recognize a gaunt figure with a scar distorting one side of his mouth. "Miss Whitmore," Jenkins called, his voice carrying false cheer. "Sheriff said we'd find you well." Margaret stepped onto her porch, deliberately leaving her rifle inside. Appearing armed might provoke rather than deter these men. "Mr. Jenkins, you've brought quite a party for a social call." Jenkins dismounted, adjusting the crude militia badge pinned to his vest. "Not entirely social, I'm afraid. We've had reports of Apache activity in these parts." His gaze swept her property with exaggerated thoroughness. "Sheriff mentioned some concerning signs yesterday." "Sheriff Dawson found nothing because there was nothing to find," Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "As I told him, I manage alone." The scarred man spat tobacco juice onto her yard. "Woman living alone, this far out. Unnatural, if you ask me." "No one did ask you, Hank," Jenkins said mildly, then turned back to Margaret with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just the same, we'll need to have a look around." "Militia business," Margaret crossed her arms. "Sheriff already conducted his search yesterday. I have work waiting." "This won't take long," Jenkins said, his tone hardening as he gestured to his men. "Thompson, check the barn. Miller, the chicken coop and outbuildings. Hank, perimeter." The men dispersed without waiting for Margaret's permission. Jenkins climbed her porch steps, standing close enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath, despite the early hour. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" he asked, the question weighted with unspoken meaning. Margaret recognized the dangerous moment for what it was. Refusal might escalate the situation, endangering both herself and Nakaheaton below. With forced calm, she stepped aside. "By all means," she said coldly, "though I've little to offer in the way of hospitality." Jenkins entered her cabin with the confident stride of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. His gaze traveled over her modest possessions, lingering on the narrow bed in the corner. "Lonely life out here for a woman," he observed, removing his hat. "Especially one used to finer things." He gestured to her few Boston remnants. The porcelain teacup, the cedar chest visible beneath her bed. Margaret remained by the door. "I prefer solitude to poor company." Jenkins laughed, the sound sharp and without humor. "Got spirit, I'll give you that." He moved around her small space, idly touching her possessions. When he reached the kitchen table, he rested his hand on its surface, directly above where Nako was hidden. "Mind if I sit? Been riding since dawn." "Actually, I do mind," Margaret replied, desperation lending her courage. "Your men are searching my property without cause or warrant. I'd prefer this intrusion end quickly." Jenkins's expression darkened. "Cause? 3 ranches raided, stock killed, buildings burned. That's cause enough." He leaned against the table, its legs scraping slightly against the floor. "Though I'm beginning to wonder why you're so unwelcoming." "Something to hide, Mrs. Whitmore." A shout from outside interrupted whatever Margaret might have answered. Thompson stood at the barn entrance, waving something in his hand. "Jenkins, found something you'll want to see." Cold dread washed through Margaret as Jenkins brushed past her toward the door. In his hand, Thompson held Nihiko's saddle blanket, patterned in distinctive Apache designs. "Well now," Jenkins said, turning to Margaret with dangerous quietness. "Isn't this interesting?" "Mexican trader," Margaret said, forcing her voice to remain steady as Jenkins thrust the saddle blanket toward her. "Passed through last month. Traded it for smoked venison and preserves." Jenkins' eyes narrowed skeptically. "Mighty coincidental. A Mexican trader with Apache goods passing only your homestead." "Not just mine," Margaret countered. "He mentioned stopping at the Morrison place next." The lie came easily, born of desperate necessity. "Said he was heading all through the territory with his wares." "Morrison's, eh?" Jenkins exchanged glances with Thompson. "Interesting, since Morrison's been empty going on 3 months now." "Old man died of fever this winter." Margaret's stomach dropped, but she maintained her composure. "Then I misunderstood him. My Spanish is limited." The scarred man, Hank, emerged from behind her cabin, carrying something that made Margaret's blood freeze. Nakohi's saddlebags, partially packed with provisions for their planned escape, found these hidden under brush by the north fence, Hank announced, packed with jerky coffee, ammunition. He upended the bags, spilling the contents onto her yard, planning a trip, Mrs. Whitmore. All pretense of civility vanished from Jenkins' demeanor. Search every inch, he ordered his men. Tear up floorboards if you have to. She's hiding him somewhere. Margaret stepped forward, desperation lending her courage. This is outrageous. Those are my supplies for a trip to visit my sister in Denver. With Apache saddlebags? Jenkins grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. There is no one here but me, Margaret insisted, trying to pull away. Jenkins released her with a shove that sent her stumbling back against the porch railing. Miller, stay with her. Rest of you, find that savage. The next half hour passed in a nightmare of destruction as the men systematically dismantled her carefully built life. They upended furniture, slashed her mattress, broke jars of preserves in their search. Margaret watched from the porch where Miller kept guard, his hand resting meaningfully on his pistol. Her mind raced through escape scenarios, each more desperate than the last. The root cellar wouldn't remain undiscovered for long. Already Thompson was in the cabin, moving furniture and tapping on floorboards. The heavy table above the trapdoor had been her only hope of concealment. A crash from inside the cabin told her that hope was now gone. Jenkins, Thompson's excited voice called. There's some kind of cellar here. Margaret lunged forward, instinctively, only to be roughly restrained by Miller. Jenkins emerged from the barn, striding quickly toward the cabin with Hank close behind. Please, Margaret begged, abandoning pride. There's been no raid here, no harm done. Whatever you think. Shut your mouth, Miller growled, tightening his grip on her arm. Time seemed to slow as Jenkins disappeared into her cabin. Margaret heard the scrape of the table being moved, the thud of the trapdoor being thrown open. Braced herself for Nakohi's capture, for gunshots, for the end of everything. Instead, Jenkins reappeared on her porch, his face flushed with anger. Empty, he spat. Just root vegetables. Relief made Margaret's knees weak. Somehow, impossibly, Nakohi had escaped. But how? The cellar had no other exit that she knew of. I told you, she said, newfound strength in her voice. I live alone. Jenkins studied her face with cold calculation. Not for much longer, he said finally. I'm placing you under arrest for suspicion of harboring hostiles and aiding Apache raiders. On what evidence? Margaret demanded. Jenkins gestured to the scattered contents of the saddlebags. These are enough. Sheriff, can sort it out. He turned to his men. Tie her hands. She rides back with us. My home, Margaret began, will still be here if you're innocent. Jenkins cut her off. Though I wouldn't count on that determination. Indian lover. As Miller bound her wrists with rough rope, Margaret's thoughts turned to Nakohi. Had he somehow tunneled out of the root cellar? Was he watching from the forest edge even now? The thought both comforted and terrified her. Comfort that he was free, terror that he might attempt some reckless rescue. Jenkins allowed her only moments to lock her cabin door before forcing her onto Thompson's horse, riding double behind the young militiaman. As they rode away, Margaret looked back at the small home she had built from nothing, the haven that had sheltered her broken spirit until it could heal and find strength again. 7 years of isolation ended in an hour of violence and accusation. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had fled Boston society's judgment, now faced frontier justice, perhaps equally corrupt, but far more immediate in its consequences. The territorial jail held few women, and none accused of consorting with Apaches during active raids. Yet as the cabin disappeared from view behind a bend in the trail, Margaret felt a strange calm settling over her. For the first time in 7 years, she was acting rather than merely surviving, protecting someone other than herself. The danger was real and immediate, but it was danger with purpose, with meaning. In the shadows of the forest paralleling the trail, a flicker of movement caught her eye, so subtle it might have been a deer or wild turkey. But Margaret recognized the deliberate stillness that followed, the calculated patience that was Nakohe's hallmark. He was following, and in that knowledge, she found the courage to face whatever waited in Copper Creek. Copper Creek's jail consisted of 2 cells in the back room of the sheriff's office, their iron bars incongruously sturdy compared to the rough-hewn timber walls surrounding them. Margaret sat on the narrow cot in the smaller cell, rubbing her wrists where the rope had chafed during the long ride to town. Sheriff Dawson had at least removed her bindings upon arrival, his face troubled as Jenkins recounted his version of events. Saddlebags packed for travel, Apache blanket hidden in her barn, and suspicious behavior, Jenkins had concluded triumphantly. Clear case of collaboration. That's so. Sheriff Dawson had responded, studying Margaret with eyes that revealed more uncertainty than conviction. And the Apache himself must have spotted us coming and fled, Jenkins admitted, but he'll be back for her. They're protective of their white women. The crude implication had brought heat to Margaret's cheeks, but she'd maintained her dignified silence. Arguing would only reinforce their assumptions. Better to let them underestimate her, a strategy she'd learned during her marriage to Charles, when appearing compliant often prevented worse treatment. Now alone in the gathering dusk as shadows lengthened across the cell floor, Margaret took stock of her situation. The charges were serious. Harboring enemies during active hostilities could carry penalties ranging from property seizure to imprisonment, possibly even hanging in territories where martial law superseded civil courts. Her only hope lay with Sheriff Dawson, whose reluctance suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of her guilt. The iron eye that had locked her cell hung on a hook near the sheriff's desk, tantalizingly visible but utterly unreachable. Its crude design spoke to local manufacture, probably crafted by the town blacksmith, but its function was no less effective for its simplicity. Margaret had tested the cell door perfunctorily, finding it solid despite the building's otherwise ramshackle construction. Sheriff Dawson entered, carrying a tray with a tin plate of beans and salt pork, a cup of coffee, and surprisingly a folded blanket. "Evenings get cold," he said gruffly, passing the items through the slot in the bars. "Thought you might need this." Margaret accepted the offerings with quiet dignity. "Thank you." Dawson lingered, clearly uncomfortable. "Jenkins is stirring up the town pretty good," he finally said. "Lot of scared folks looking for someone to blame for these raids, and I'm convenient," Margaret concluded. "Something like that." Dawson scratched his stubbled chin. "Thing is, I've known you 7 years, Mrs. Whitmore. Never known you to cause trouble or break the law." Margaret set the tray aside. "Then why am I in this cell, Sheriff?" "You were harboring someone," he stated flatly. "Maybe not a raider, but definitely Apache. That saddle blanket wasn't from any Mexican trader. I've been on this frontier 30 years. I know Apache craftsmanship when I see it." Margaret neither confirmed nor denied the accusation, maintaining the steady gaze that had served her well in Boston, drawing rooms when whispers about Charles's affairs had reached her ears. Dawson sighed. "Circuit judge doesn't come through for another 2 weeks. Until then, I'm obliged to keep you here." "And if Jenkins decides not to wait for the judge?" Margaret asked quietly. The sheriff's expression darkened. "I'm still the law in Copper Creek, Mrs. Whitmore. No vigilante justice while I wear this badge." After he left, Margaret ate mechanically, her mind turning over possible outcomes. Escape seemed impossible. The cell was solid, the window too small even for her slim frame, and the town now alert to the possibility of an Apache accomplice who might attempt rescue. Night fell completely, the sheriff's office illuminated only by a single lantern on the desk outside her cell. Dawson had retired to his adjacent quarters, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the oppressive darkness. A soft scraping at the window startled her from half-sleep. Moonlight silhouetted a familiar figure peering through the small opening. Nakaha, his face a study in controlled urgency. "You shouldn't be here," Margaret whispered, moving to the window. "The town is looking for you." "Could not leave you," he replied simply. His fingers reached through the bars, briefly touching hers. "Working on plan. It's too dangerous," she insisted. There are armed men patrolling. 3 men at saloon. Nakaha interrupted with quiet confidence. 2 sleeping at boarding house. Sheriff in back room. His precise knowledge of the town's security made clear he had been observing for hours, mapping patterns and weaknesses. The key, Margaret whispered, gesturing toward the sheriff's desk. It's there, but I can't reach it. Nakaha's eyes followed her gesture, then returned to her face. 2 nights, he said. Be ready when moon is highest. Before she could question him further, he vanished into the shadows, leaving Margaret with a conflicting mixture of hope and dread. 2 nights. Whatever plan Nakaha was formulating would happen then. She returned to her cot, pulling the sheriff's blanket around her shoulders against the deepening chill. The key to her cell gleamed dully in the lantern light, a symbol of constraint, but also, perhaps, of potential freedom. 7 years ago she had fled one form of imprisonment, only to build another, walls of isolation constructed by her own hands. Now, those walls had crumbled, leaving her vulnerable but also, paradoxically, more alive than she had felt in years. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that echoed across the sleeping town. Margaret closed her eyes, drawing strength from the memory of Nakaha's fingers briefly touching hers through the window bars. A promise, unspoken, but understood. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The first day of Margaret's imprisonment passed with excruciating slowness. From her cell, she could hear the normal rhythms of Copper Creek merchants calling to customers, wagons creaking down the main street, the distant piano from the saloon, ordinary life continuing while hers hung in suspension. Sheriff Dawson spent most of the day at his desk, methodically writing in a thick leather-bound ledger. Occasionally, he would glance up at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Not quite suspicion, not quite sympathy. What will happen to my property? She finally asked as afternoon light slanted through the small office window. Dawson looked up from his writing. Law says it remains yours unless you're convicted, though I can't guarantee someone won't help themselves if it sits empty too long. 7 years of work, Margaret said quietly. Everything I built. The sheriff's pen paused over his ledger. Should have thought of that before getting involved with an Apache, ma'am. Is it the involvement that troubles you, Sheriff, or that he's Apache? Dawson's weathered face registered surprise at her directness. He closed the ledger carefully. Both carry consequences in these parts, as you well know. By evening, visitors arrived. First Jenkins, strutting with the self-importance of a man who believes he's delivered justice. Then, unexpectedly, the young militiaman Thompson, who stared at Margaret with undisguised curiosity. Thought Indians took unwilling women, Thompson remarked to Dawson, as if Margaret couldn't hear him through the bars mere feet away. This one went willingly. Ain't natural. That's enough, Dawson responded, more sharply than Margaret had expected. Miss Whitmore is awaiting proper trial, not your judgment. After they left, Dawson returned to his ledger, writing with unusual intensity. When he finally closed the book for the night, he approached Margaret's cell. Jenkins is pushing for a town meeting tomorrow, he said quietly. Wants to discuss your case before the judge arrives. Margaret understood the implication. Vigilante justice. I won't allow it, Dawson stated firmly, but you should know tensions are high. That raid on the Williams place was bad. 2 children barely escaped the fire. I had nothing to do with any raids, Margaret said. Dawson studied her face. Maybe not. But your friend, can you say the same for him? Yes, Margaret replied without hesitation. He lives apart from his tribe precisely because he refuses violence. Something shifted in the sheriff's expression. That's so. He seemed to consider this information, then abruptly changed the subject. You'll have the cell to yourself tonight. Town's quiet. The second day brought unexpected development. Margaret woke to find Dawson already at his desk. The ledger opened before him as he compared its contents with a stack of wanted posters. Jenkins isn't who he claims to be, the sheriff said without preamble when he noticed Margaret watching. Man matching his description was involved in claim-jumping incidents near Tucson last year. Calling himself Jefferson then. Margaret absorbed this information. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm starting to wonder about these raids," Dawson replied, tapping the ledger. "Patterns don't add up. Apaches don't usually burn buildings with people inside. They're practical fighters. They take what they need and disappear." He turned the ledger toward her, revealing meticulous notes on each reported incident. Williams Place, buildings burned, no livestock taken. Morrison's trading post, goods destroyed, not stolen. Makes no sense. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, hope cautiously kindling. Before Dawson could answer, the office door burst open. Jenkins stood there, flanked by Miller and 3 men. Margaret didn't recognize. All were armed. "Town meeting's been moved up," Jenkins announced. "We're here for the prisoner." Dawson rose slowly. "There's no meeting authorized, Jenkins. The woman stays here until the circuit judge arrives." Jenkins smiled unpleasantly. "Town voted already. Informal-like. Decided we can't risk more Apache attacks while waiting on some judge who might not show for a month." "That's not how the law works," Dawson said, his hand moving toward his holstered pistol. "Law's what keeps people safe," Jenkins countered. "Right now, that means making an example of Indian lovers and spies." He nodded to his men. "Take her." Dawson drew his weapon. "Step back, all of you. I'm still sheriff here." For a tense moment, the men faced each other in silent confrontation. Then Jenkins laughed. A cold sound without humor. "1 old man against 5 of us. Bad odds, Sheriff." "Make that 2 against 5, came a new voice from the doorway. Sheriff Dawson's deputy, a lanky young man Margaret recognized from previous visits to town, stood with his rifle raised. "Though I'm betting the sheriff, and I can take at least 3 of you before you get to those keys." The standoff stretched into uncomfortable silence. Finally, Jenkins stepped back. "This isn't over, Dawson. Town's scared, and scared people need action." "Town needs truth," Dawson countered. "And I'm starting to think you've been lying about a lot of things, Jefferson." A flash of alarm crossed Jenkins' face at the name. Without another word, he gestured to his men, and they backed out of the office. When they were gone, Dawson returned to his desk, hands slightly shaking as he opened his ledger again. "Been doing some research on our militia captain," he told Margaret. "Man's got a history of stirring up trouble where it benefits him." He tapped a page covered with notes. "Question is, what's he really after?" As twilight descended on Copper Creek, Margaret paced her small cell. Tonight was the night Nakohi had promised to return. But with tensions in town reaching breaking point, any rescue attempt would be more dangerous than ever. From her window, she could see armed men gathering on the street corners, waiting, watching. The air itself seemed charged with impending violence. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the town limits, Nakohi was preparing to risk everything for her freedom. Midnight approached with agonizing slowness. Margaret sat motionless on her cot, every sense heightened to painful awareness. Sheriff Dawson had retired to his quarters an hour earlier, leaving the office dimly lit by a single oil lamp turned low. His deputy dozed in a chair by the door, rifle across his knees, additional security after Jenkins' earlier confrontation. Outside, the air had grown unnaturally still. The piano from the saloon had fallen silent, and even the night insects seemed to be holding their breath. A distant rumble of thunder broke the unnatural quiet, a spring storm approaching from the mountains. Margaret moved to her small window, scanning the darkness for any sign of Nak. The moon, nearly full, ducked in and out of gathering clouds, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow across the back alley. Perfect conditions for stealth. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the deputy startled awake, mumbling something incomprehensible before settling back into uneasy sleep. Margaret counted his breaths until they deepened and slowed once more. A flicker of movement near the woodpile behind the jail caught her attention. A shadow detached itself from deeper darkness. Nakaha, moving with the fluid grace of one born to wilderness. He pressed himself against the jail's exterior wall, directly beneath her window, but out of her line of sight. Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she feared it might wake the deputy. What was Nakaha planning? The cell key still hung on its hook near the sheriff's desk, tantalizingly visible but unreachable. The storm broke in earnest, rain suddenly sheeting down in silver curtains. Thunder boomed directly overhead, rattling the jail's windows. In that same moment, small objects sailed through the narrow opening of Margaret's window, landing with a soft thud on her cot. A stone wrapped in a strip of leather. Unwinding it quickly, Margaret found a message scratched in charcoal. Fire, North End, soon. Understanding dawned with cold clarity. A diversion. She tucked the leather strip into her boot and resumed her position of patient waiting. The deputy jerked awake at a particularly violent thunderclap. Rising stiffly, he moved to the front window, peering out at the rain-soaked street. "Quite a storm," he muttered, seemingly to himself. Minutes later, shouts erupted from the north end of town. The deputy tensed, moving to the door just as it burst open. A drenched townsman stood there, panic evident in his voice. "Fire! The lumberyard's ablaze." The deputy grabbed his slicker from a peg. "Wake the sheriff," he ordered the messenger. "I'll ring the alarm bell." Both men disappeared into the storm, leaving the office momentarily unattended. Within seconds, the back window of the sheriff's office shattered inward. Narco slipped through the opening with fluid economy of movement, shards of glass tinkling around him like wind chimes. "Quickly," he urged, crossing to the hook where the cell key hung. The iron key looked massive in his nimble fingers as he unlocked Margaret's cell. "Town is distracted, but not for long." "The sheriff," Margaret began, but Narco shook his head. "No time. Horses waiting beyond the creek." They moved toward the broken window, but before they could reach it, the office door swung open. Sheriff Dawson stood framed in the doorway, revolver drawn and expression grim. "That's far enough," he said quietly. Margaret froze, but Narco shifted subtly, positioning himself between her and the sheriff's weapon. The three remained locked in tense tableau as rain poured through the broken window, forming a puddle on the rough plank floor. "Please," Margaret said finally, "we mean no harm. We're leaving the territory." "Jenkins is organizing a search party for him," Dawson replied, jerking his chin toward Narco. "Man's determined to collect that Apache bounty." "Jenkins is a claim jumper," Margaret countered. "You said so yourself." Something shifted in Dawson's weathered face. "Suspected as much. Man shows up just before raids start, uses fear to gain influence. His revolver remains steady. Still doesn't change the fact that harboring hostiles is against territorial law." "He is not hostile," Margaret stated firmly. "He refused to join the raids. It's why he lives apart from his tribe." Lightning flashed, illuminating the small office in harsh white light. In that frozen moment, Margaret saw the conflict etched in Dawson's features. Duty warring with a deeper sense of justice. "Sheriff," Narcohe spoke for the first time, his voice calm despite the weapon aimed at his chest. "The fires at the ranches, not Apache work." Dawson's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Apache take what is needed: food, horses, weapons," Narcohe said. "Never burn without purpose. Never harm women, children." "Jenkins," Margaret added, understanding dawning. "The raid started when he arrived. What if he's creating the very threat he's promising to fight?" The sheriff's gaze moved between them, calculation in his eyes. Outside, the alarm bell pealed through the storm, calling men to fight the lumberyard fire. Time was running out. Finally, Dawson lowered his weapon. "South Fork of the Gila River," he said abruptly. "There's a trading post run by a Frenchman named Benoit. Tell him Max Dawson sent you." He holstered his revolver. "Now go. I'll delay any pursuit." Relief flooded through Margaret. "Thank ye," she whispered. "Don't thank me," Dawson replied grimly. "Just get across the border. Territory's no place for either of you now." As they slipped through the broken window into the raging storm, Margaret cast one final glance back. Sheriff Dawson stood silhouetted against the lamplight, his face unreadable, as he watched them disappear into the darkness. The thunderstorm enveloped them like a protective cloak, its fury drowning the sounds of their escape. Rain plastered Margaret's hair to her face, soaked her clothing, and turned the ground beneath their feet to treacherous mud. Yet she had never felt more alive, more present in her own body. They ran through Copper Creek's back alleys, past rain-blurred buildings that had represented civilization's constraints. With each step, Margaret felt the weight of 7 years of isolation falling away, replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of an uncertain future. 6 months passed like a dream. Spring surrendered to summer's fierce heat, then softened into autumn's golden haze. Now, as Margaret stood in the doorway of their small adobe house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, it seemed impossible that Copper Creek and her cabin in Arizona Territory had ever existed. The village of Santa Elena nestled in a fertile valley, just south of the Mexican border. Its residents, a mixture of Mexican farmers, displaced Apaches and American exiles, had welcomed them with the easy acceptance of those who understood what it meant to exist between worlds. Margaret inhaled the rich aroma rising from the clay cooking pot suspended over their outdoor fire pit. The olla had been a gift from Elena, the village elder's wife, who had taken Margaret under her wing, teaching her to prepare traditional Mexican dishes, while Margaret shared her knowledge of herbal remedies and food preservation. "Smells good," Nakaho said, approaching from the garden where he'd been harvesting the last of their summer squash. His English had improved over the months, though they often spoke in a blend of languages, English mixed with Spanish phrases, and Apache words that had no direct translation. Margaret smiled, accepting the vegetables he offered. "Elena says my chill stew is almost authentic now." "Only almost." Nakaho's eyes crinkled with humor. "She says I still cook like a gringa sometimes." Margaret stirred the fragrant stew, too cautious with the spices. Their journey to this place had been arduous. Days of hard riding through wilderness, always alert for pursuit. Jenkins and his militia had followed them as far as the border, but Sheriff Dawson had been true to his word, delaying the search party long enough to give them a crucial head start. Benoit's trading post had provided temporary shelter and, more importantly, connections to guides who knew safe passages south. The Frenchman had asked no questions when Margaret mentioned Max Dawson's name, simply nodding and offering them the use of his back room for 2 days while arrangements were made. Now, months later, they had built something neither had believed possible: a home, a community, a life unbound by the rigid expectations of the worlds they'd left behind. Children asked for more English lessons tomorrow, Nakohi mentioned as they settled on the bench outside their door to eat. The simple wooden seat faced west, positioned perfectly to capture the sunset, a deliberate choice when they'd built the house. Margaret nodded. The village children came 3 times weekly to learn reading and writing from her, their eager minds absorbing knowledge with a hunger that reminded her of her own childhood love of learning. "Miguel is showing real aptitude for mathematics," she replied. "His father says he might send him to school in Hermosillo next year." Their conversation flowed easily now, the initial awkwardness long since replaced by comfortable familiarity. "I had married in the village's small adobe church 2 weeks after arriving, a simple ceremony conducted by a traveling priest who raised an eyebrow at their unlikely union, but performed the rites nonetheless. Marriage to Nakohi bore no resemblance to her union with Charles. Where Charles had sought to possess and control, Nakohi offered partnership and respect. Their differences of culture, experience, expectation became strengths rather than divisions, each learning from the other's perspective. "Letter came today," Nakohi said, reaching into his shirt to produce a much-traveled envelope. "From your sister." Margaret accepted it eagerly. 3 months ago, after much deliberation, she had written to Elizabeth at her Boston address, breaking 7 years of silence. The risk had seemed worth taking. Jenkins and his militia had no reach in Boston society, and Margaret yearned to reconnect with the one family member who had shown her kindness during the scandal of her divorce. The letter was thick, pages filled with Elizabeth's elegant handwriting. Margaret would read it later, savoring each word in private. Her sister's first response had been tearful with relief, believing Margaret long dead after her disappearance west. "Also," Nakohi continued, "Ramon says silver was discovered near Copper Creek." Margaret looked up sharply. "Silver, large deposit, on land near your cabin." Understanding dawned slowly. "Jenkins," she said, "he wasn't after Apache bounties. He wanted my land." Nakohi nodded. Sheriff Dawson suspected, wrote that Jenkins disappeared after we escaped. Took new name elsewhere. Probably. The revelation should have angered her. The injustice, the manipulation, the lives endangered for mere profit. Instead, Margaret felt an unexpected sense of closure. Her cabin, her years of solitary existence, the fragile independence she had guarded so fiercely, all had been stepping stones rather than a destination. "Do you ever wish to return?" Nakahi asked, reading her thoughts with the intuition that had drawn her to him from the beginning. Margaret considered the question seriously. The 7 years of isolation had healed certain wounds, had given her strength and self-reliance she might never have discovered otherwise. But they had also been years of half-living, of existence without true connection. "No," she answered, truthfully, "this is home now." As darkness settled over the valley, lamps glowed to life in the scattered houses of Santa Elena. From the village center came the sounds of guitar music and children's laughter. Margaret leaned against Nakahi's shoulder, his arm coming around her with natural ease. "When I first saw you," he said quietly, "standing on your porch with rifle in hands, I thought, here is woman whose spirit speaks without words." Margaret smiled at the memory. "I was terrified and determined not to show it. Like good warrior," he agreed with gentle humor. "But eyes cannot hide truth." "And what truth did my eyes show?" she asked. "Same as mine," Nakahi replied simply. "Loneliness and hope that would not die." In the distance, coyotes called to one another. Across the darkening landscape, Margaret closed her eyes, listening to their wild voices echoing through the hills. Once, she had believed silence was her only protection, isolation her only safety. "I haven't spoken to a man in years," she whispered, echoing her confession from what seemed a lifetime ago. Nakahi's arms tightened around her. "Now you speak," he murmured against her hair, "and I listen." Together they sat as stars emerged in the vast desert sky, their silence no longer a barrier, but a shared language, rich with meaning and possibility.